Welcome back to the Dark Reading News Desk here at Black Hat USA. I'm your faithful host, Terry Sweeney. Joining me now is Nick Biasini, Head of Outreach with Cisco Talos. Nick, thanks for joining us on the Dark Reading News Desk.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate you doing this. In security, we like to talk about tactics, techniques, and procedures, aka TTPs. Get us started with talking about the TTPs that security practitioners are seeing from threat actors these days.
Well, TTPs are really the key indicator that we go off of when we're talking about actors. So a lot of what we'll see is malware. This is more the behaviors of the actors that are deploying the malware. So what we'll see commonly today is use of open source utilities, whether that is C2 frameworks like Cobalt Strike or various other things. You'll see open source tooling. You'll see living off the land binaries an awful lot, and using of legitimate remote access tools for their own benefit. So using the utilities that businesses use to do remote access because it makes it very difficult to block.
So more about the strategies and the MOs as opposed to the code or the way that it behaves once it's deployed.
Exactly. It's more like what the adversary does to either deploy the malware or what they do with the access once they have the malware. We try to look at those behaviors and identify those behaviors. It's a really good way to determine malicious activity without having to rely on things like a specific malware sample.
What are some of the top TTPs that are sort of dominating the threatscape these days?
It's tough. It really depends on the groups that you're talking about.
Okay.
So if you're talking about like state-sponsored groups, they're going to tend to use a different set of TTPs. They're going to live in a slightly different landscape than you would see the criminal organizations in. But honestly, we're seeing a lot of collapsing of the tooling because it makes it so that it's much harder to attribute. If everybody is using the same tools, how do you differentiate between one group and the other? It makes it a little bit more difficult to differentiate.
Say more about that. What do you mean by collapsing exactly?
So in the past, you would see groups would use their own tooling. Like they would have a custom piece of malware that they would deploy to do something. Today, what we're seeing is everybody is instead either using the same open source tool or they're using the utilities that are already built into the systems instead of relying on their own custom tooling. That way, if they get detected, it's not, oh, well, this is this one piece of malware that's only associated.
No signature.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly.
Interesting. What solutions are on the market right now that can help security practitioners defend against these kinds of threats?
Probably the biggest thing right now is XDR, extended data detection and response. So the challenge that organizations face is today you're securing a bunch of disparate systems in disparate locations that are using different stacks and have different functional groups, and being able to quickly correlate not just across those systems, but add in all the other indicators that you have available to you. Things like network indicators, stuff that you're able to pull out of identity, things that you can pull out of email so that you can get a much more holistic view of what's happening. So instead of saying, bad piece of malware detected, you can say a bad piece of malware was detected. It appears to be delivered through this manner. Here are the domains that it reached out to. This is what it did after the fact. They're both alerts, but one is far more actionable than the other.
Okay. Talk a bit about how Cisco competes in the XDR space.
Well, we have a new offering that's recently generally available. We've been spending a lot of time working to really drive home the capability not just to detect across Cisco devices, but the ability and the acknowledgement that you have to be able to work across multiple products from multiple vendors. So providing the ability to support not just Cisco products, but other products to give that holistic view is a really key part of our XDR vision.
A criticism that I heard earlier today about, I guess, detection and response broadly, not about XDR specifically, is in the case of like a mobile handheld or like just a more finely grained endpoint device. Detection and response is less effective, if not completely useless in those instances. Does XDR, is that end-to-end, or how does that actually work?
Well, that's where those other indicators come in. So you may not have a huge amount of visibility off of, say, that smart handheld device, but the communications that it establishes, the behaviors that it kind of performs, that can all be key indicators to help drive that detection and response.
You've been talking about a compromise that occurred to Cisco last year. Can you talk us through what happened at a high level and maybe even some of the lessons that were learned from that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the initial access vector is a great example of the challenges that organizations face today. So you have commonly things like password vaults. One of the password vaults that's available is inside of web browsers, right? So you can say, like a Chrome web browser, you can store all your passwords, and then any computer that you walked up to that has Chrome installed, you put in your one password, you have access to everything you need. So it is incredibly valuable from a user perspective. The problem is you can store whatever credentials you want there. In this instance, we had a user that stored their Cisco credentials in this vault. Now, they didn't have their Cisco account compromised, but they had their Google account compromised. Now, when the Google account was compromised, the actor had access to the Cisco credentials. Then they had to work on bypassing MFA. Fortunately for us, we're not just a username and password organization. So we saw both MFA fatigue and vishing, or social engineering over the phone, as potential avenues to get past MFA. They were able to successfully do that. They ended up eventually enrolling their own mobile devices and then maintaining that access. They were trying to do things like data exfiltration. I talked about the tooling that I talked about was actually consistent. We saw open source frameworks. We saw living off the land binaries. We did, however, see a custom backdoor deployed that we had seen before in a previous incident response engagement, and that really helped us understand what type of adversary we were dealing with and helped us kind of successfully expel them from the environment. The biggest things that we learned out of that was making sure that you harden your MFA process, because doing things like challenge codes and putting protections around mobile device enrollment makes a really big difference, as well as educating your users about what MFA fatigue is, how to handle these types of attacks. Speaking of education, social engineering, really needing to drive home to users what is normal behavior, what is abnormal behavior, what are folks never going to ask you on the phone, to make sure that they understand. And then really this was the thing that helped drive our XDR vision, because we saw the challenges of managing disparate locations, disparate systems, very disparate stacks, and really needing to pull telemetry data from a variety of sources to really have a better understanding of the compromise.
Well, I mean, social engineering, it is a timeless classic, is it not? I mean,
it really is.
Just always effective.
Well, people want to help. By their nature, they want to be helpful, and unfortunately, bad guys use that against you.
Well, especially if you're call up and are frantic and really, really sell it. I mean, I guess obviously it works.
Oh yeah, they'll come after you with the carrot and the stick, whatever will work at any given time.
Okay. You alluded a little bit to this, but talk a bit more about how companies can ensure that an attack like that doesn't happen to them, and in the event that it does, like what can they do to regain control of the situation?
Yeah, so we have a bunch of utilities that are out there. We just had a new ransomware offering that we came out with to kind of help remediate when organizations do find themselves in this unfortunate location. The most important thing, though, is making sure that you have protections in place, you have visibility in place, and that you're maintaining a good security posture. Far too often we see simple mistakes that organizations make lead to these types of compromise. So, like I always say, defense is hard, offense is easy. You have to be right 100% of the time. It's a very, very daunting task.
Well, that's a good rule of thumb. How do you foresee these solutions affecting the future of the threat landscape?
Well, we're seeing adversaries get more and more sophisticated. There is more and more capabilities available to more and more groups than we've ever had before. You have what would historically have been reserved for only the most elite of state-sponsored groups. Those types of TTPs and behaviors are common for criminal organizations now. It's going to be a tough landscape out there for the foreseeable future, but with good technology in place, making sure that you're prepared for the eventuality of a compromise, you're much better off doing the work to make sure you're ready before it happens than find yourself scrambling in a moment when you're really in need and find that you aren't really prepared.
Yeah. Nick, thanks for sharing the lessons learned and just being transparent with the guidance as well. Really, really appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on the Dark Reading News Desk today.
Happy to be here.
We've been talking with Nick Biasini of Cisco Talos. This has been Terry Sweeney with the Dark Reading News Desk. Thanks for joining us for this segment. We'll see you next time.